The wind screamed across the desert, carrying with it a storm of sand that clawed at every crack in the town's bones. The saloon lamps flickered and died. Shutters rattled on their hinges, and the church bell swung weakly, though no hand pulled its rope. In the dark, the streets of Red Mesa vanished beneath waves of dust, as if the whole town were being swallowed by the earth itself. Inside his cabin at the far edge of town, Sheriff Luke Marston sat hunched at a small table, a half-empty bottle of rye before him and a revolver lying within easy reach. His eyes were shadowed with years of wear, the weight of old failures pressing down heavier than the sand against his roof. He'd grown used to nights like this, lonely, restless, filled with the hollow scrape of memory. He thought of the dead more than the living these days. The pounding came sudden, so hard and frantic it rattled the boards. Luke's head snapped up, hand sliding instinctively to the Colt. The storm masked most sounds, but this was desperate. A voice broke through, muffled but urgent. "Please, open! For God's sake, Sheriff!" He moved slowly, gun raised as he unlatched the door. It burst inward with the weight of the storm, and with it stumbled a woman, cloak torn, hair whipped wild by the wind, her face streaked with sand and tears. She collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath as though she'd outrun death itself. "They'll kill me before dawn if you don't ride with me," she said, her voice cracking. Her hands clutched a leather satchel to her chest as if it were her heart. Luke caught her by the arm, steadying her, eyes narrowing. "Who's after you?" Behind her, through the veil of sand, he saw the glow of torches, a line of them swaying in the storm, closing in on his cabin like a ring of fire. Men's voices shouted his name, mocking, demanding. The storm carried the sound like a curse. Luke's jaw clenched. He knew that kind of hunt. He knew the kind of men who came with torches in the night. His grip tightened on the revolver, the weight of decision pressing down like a millstone. He had hidden from duty before, buried his oath under whiskey and silence. But something in the woman's eyes, something pleading, something accusing, dragged him back to the graves he never forgot. She leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper almost lost in the howl of the wind. "Please, Sheriff, ride me through the night." The shutters shook under heavy fists. Dust and firelight spilled through the cracks, painting the cabin walls in streaks of red. Luke raised the revolver, thumb pulling the hammer back with a sharp click that cut through the storm. Outside, the riders roared his name again. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, fear, and the promise of violence. And then the door shuttered once, twice, before exploding inward in a spray of splinters. If you want to see how this fight between law and corruption unfolds under the burning desert sky, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss a single moment of this ride. Luke Marston stood in the dim glow of the lantern, revolver heavy in his hand. The storm rattling every timber of the cabin. Maria's breath came ragged. Dust caked into the corners of her eyes, her voice trembling from fear and exhaustion. "They'll kill me before dawn if you don't ride with me," she whispered again, clutching that worn satchel as if her very life hung by the straps. He had seen fear plenty of times before, but what burned in her gaze was different. Something he recognized, something that dragged him back to another night years ago, when the desert had demanded its price from him. The pounding at the shutters grew harder, a man's voice barking his name through the roar of the storm. Luke's knuckles whitened on the grip of his Colt, but his mind drifted unbidden to the grave outside of town where Deputy Henry Shaw lay. Henry had been a boy in all but years, eager to prove himself, eager to stand shoulder to shoulder with his sheriff. Luke had promised Henry's mother he would keep the boy safe. Then came the raid at Dry Creek, half a dozen riders hungry for blood and plunder. Luke remembered the smoke, the screams, the farmhouse burning to ash, and Henry standing in the doorway firing until his bullets ran dry. Luke had been too far, too slow. He found the boy cut down in the dust, his mother's body beside him. He buried them both before the sun rose. That day, Luke's badge had felt more like a chain than a shield. Since then, every oath, every law had carried the weight of that broken promise. Maria's voice yanked him back to the present. "These men, they ride for Elias Vance." She spat the name like it was poison. "He owns half this desert. What he doesn't buy, he burns. My brother died in the mines, he collapsed, and I have proof." She opened the satchel enough for Luke to glimpse papers, dark ink scrawled in shaky lines across weathered sheets, contracts, signatures, and a folded letter with a dying man's name on it. He only saw a flash before she stuffed it closed again, but it was enough to send a chill up his spine. "You don't understand what you're carrying," he muttered. "I understand more than you think," Maria shot back, her eyes hard through the dust and fear. "Vance killed for profit, and if I die tonight, no one will ever know. You owe the dead more than silence, Sheriff." The words cut deep. They were Henry's eyes staring at him through hers, the same plea without a voice. Luke's chest tightened as he thought of the grave marker he had carved with his own hands, the rain dripping down the wood as he swore he'd never fail the dead again. He had lived in that hollow oath for years, drifting between days, hiding behind routine, and now in this storm, that debt had come to collect. The pounding on the walls suddenly stopped. Luke and Maria froze, glancing at each other. The storm still howled, but the voices outside fell into silence, unnatural, heavy. He knew men like Vance's riders, wolves in human skin. Silence from them never meant retreat. It meant planning, positioning, waiting for the crack in the door. Maria whispered, "Why did they stop?" Luke shook his head slowly, stepping to the window, pistol raised. "Because the killing's about to begin." Just then, a flaming torch arced through the night air and smashed through the glass. Fire spilled across the wooden floorboards as the curtain ignited, and the cabin filled with choking smoke. Maria screamed as she scrambled back, and Luke cursed under his breath, slamming his hat down on his head. His cabin, his refuge, was about to become their tomb, and outside, voices rose in laughter. The horses exploded from the smoke-choked cabin like spirits driven by fire, hooves hammering the dirt so hard it shook up through the saddles. Behind them, the flames ate the only safe walls Luke Marston had known, sparks whipping into the storm like fireflies carried on the wind. Gunshots split the roar of sand, sharp cracks that chased them into the night. Marston kept low over his gelding's neck, teeth clenched, jaw locked in grim determination. The storm cut into his face like glass shards, but he didn't blink. He couldn't. Maria clung behind him, her hands white on the reins, the satchel strapped against her chest. She coughed smoke and dust, her words nearly lost to the wind. "This will hang him if it reaches the judge." The way she said it wasn't desperation, it was faith, conviction carved into every syllable. She held tighter to the satchel, as if the papers inside were more fragile than her bones. The desert around them was a shifting void, shapes of ghostly cacti rising, then vanishing in the torrent of dust. Lightning flashed, illuminating the pursuers, dark riders spurring hard, their torches little more than smears of red light swallowed by the storm. Shadows stretched long across the sand, closing in like wolves circling a wounded elk. Luke fired blindly over his shoulder, the revolver barking flame, and one rider pulled back with a scream, clutching his shoulder as his horse veered off. But two more surged forward, hooves pounding closer, steel catching the lightning. Marston shoved Maria down lower against his back, shielding her as he swung his revolver again. The storm muffled sound, but the hiss of a blade cutting through air was unmistakable. A rider lunged in from the side, machete flashing pale in the night. Marston twisted, his elbow knocking Maria against the saddle horn as he fired point blank. The blast lit the man's face for a heartbeat, eyes wide, mouth open in a howl, before he tumbled sideways, the machete slipping from his grip and spinning into the sand. His horse bolted riderless into the storm. "Hold on!" Luke shouted through the wind, yanking the reins, pushing his gelding harder. His throat burned with smoke, his eyes watering, but his mind sharpened like tempered steel. The old failures clawed at him, the graves he carried in his memory, but he refused to add her to them. Not this night. The riders shouted behind, voices torn apart by the storm. Bullets whined past, chewing up sand near the horse's hooves. Maria flinched, her fingers digging into Luke's coat, but she didn't cry out. She just clung to that satchel as though the lives of the buried miners, her brother among them, still cried out from inside the leather straps. The storm began to thin. The gusts eased for a moment, revealing the desert in the pale wash of a dying moon. Luke urged his horse forward, eyes searching for the trail ahead. Relief sparked when he saw the canyon's dark throat opening before them, a narrow cut through stone that could hide them from the storm and maybe buy time to outrun the pack. But the relief died just as quick. The canyon mouth wasn't empty. Shapes moved there, dozens of them, rifles catching moonlight, horses standing in grim silence. A wall of riders stretched across the only trail, their faces hard beneath their wide-brimmed hats. The storm lifted just enough for torches to glow steady, painting the rock walls in blood-colored light. Luke pulled the reins, heart hammering as the gelding skidded in the sand. Maria gasped, staring at the blockade. The night went still, the storm drawing a sharp breath before the next howl. Ahead of them, the canyon was choked with Vance's men waiting, rifles leveled, as if the desert itself had decided to close its jaws. The canyon's throat glowed with torchlight, every flame revealing the line of riders stretched across the narrow trail. Horses shifted restlessly, snorting clouds of steam into the cold desert air. But their riders sat steady in their saddles, rifles gleaming like the eyes of wolves in the dark. Luke Marston pulled his gelding up short, the animal pawing at the earth as if it too felt the trap closing around them. Briggs, a broad-shouldered man with a scar cutting across his cheek, eased his horse forward from the line. His hat was low, his grin carved out of cruelty. He called out above the storm's ragged breath, "Hand her over, Sheriff." Sunrise don't need two corpses. Maria trembled behind Luke, clutching the satchel so tight it looked as though her fingers might break the leather straps. Luke didn't answer right away. He just stared across the space between them, measuring the odds, counting rifles. Too many. Far too many. He could hear Henry's voice in his mind again, that boyish tone echoing from the grave. Never run, never surrender. He swallowed the bitter taste of failure and leaned back just enough to murmur to Maria, "Hold tight. Do as I do." She nodded, though her breathing was fast, shallow. Briggs tilted his head, amused. "Don't make me count, Sheriff. 1. He raised a gloved hand. 2. Luke spurred his horse to the right, not forward but into the jagged shadows along the canyon wall. Gunfire erupted instantly, the crack of rifles bouncing between the stone cliffs. Bullets sparked off the rock, sending shards and dust into the night air. Maria cried out as a fragment cut her cheek, but Luke pressed on, keeping the gelding tight against the wall, looking for the faint trail he remembered from years ago when mule trains carried salt through this pass. "There," he hissed, spotting the narrow incline that wound upward like a hidden scar on the canyon face. He yanked the reins and the gelding scrambled up the slope, hooves slipping on loose shale. Maria clung to him, head ducked low. Another shot rang out closer this time, and stone exploded inches from Luke's boot. Briggs bellowed below, fury twisting his words. "Shoot the horse if you have to. Don't let them clear the wall." Luke urged the animal harder, feeling the strain in its muscles as it clawed for footing. A bullet hissed past his ear, and another clipped the edge of Maria's satchel. The leather split open with a sickening rip, and papers burst free, fluttering into the storm like wounded birds. Contracts, ledgers, sworn statements, they scattered on the wind, tumbling into darkness. Maria gasped and reached out instinctively, but Luke grabbed her wrist. "Leave them," he barked. "We'll get what's left." The mule path curved higher out of the rifle's direct line. Torches below flickered as the riders tried to adjust, but the angle favored Luke now. Bullets sparked harmlessly off stone or vanished into the night. His gelding found surer ground, scrambling up to the rim of the canyon. Below, Briggs sat back in his saddle, his voice echoing off the canyon walls like a curse. "You hear me, Sheriff? No one outruns sunrise." Luke didn't look back. The words trailed them like a shadow, heavy and certain as the last of the precious papers danced away into the desert wind. The ruined church leaned against the desert like the last broken tooth in a skull. Its steeple was half collapsed, leaning eastward as though bowing to time, and the stained glass windows had long since shattered, leaving only jagged teeth of colored glass framing the blackness within. Luke Marston pushed the door with his shoulder, the creak swallowed by the storm's fading howl, and guided Maria inside. The air was heavy with dust and rot. A lantern still hung from a crooked hook near the pulpit. Luke struck a match with steady fingers and lit it, filling the hollow place with a dim, trembling glow. They sank down on the broken pews, both breathing hard. Horses tied outside in the skeletal yard where crooked crosses leaned like drunks. Maria's hands shook as she gathered what was left of the satchel's contents. Some of the papers were torn, dirt ground into the ink, but others remained intact. She spread them across the warped wood of the pew, the lantern glow pulling secrets from every page. Luke leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he traced the spidery signatures and stiff legal phrasing. Ledgers showing money transferred to shell accounts, contracts signed under duress, receipts for explosives bought by false names. And then one document heavier than the rest, an affidavit, ink smudged as though written by a trembling hand. At the bottom, the signature of a foreman, shaky letters curling across the page. Luke read the words in silence. "Ordered blast in shaft 4 against warnings. Miners still inside. No accident. By command of Elias Vance. His jaw tightened until it ached. He saw the scrawled note at the edge, barely legible. I write this before the dust takes me, so someone will know. Maria's voice cracked the silence. My brother was one of them. He went down to the shaft that morning and never came back. They told us it was a cave-in. God's will, they said. But I knew. Vance buried him alive to save a week's wages. Luke's fist closed so tight on the affidavit that the paper crumpled. He forced his hand to unclench to smooth it flat again, though his heart hammered like a war drum. This is enough, he muttered. His voice was low like distant thunder. Enough to bury him in court. Enough to burn his empire down. Maria looked at him, her eyes hollow yet fierce. If we survive to deliver it. The storm outside rumbled low, rolling across the desert like a warning. The church walls shivered as the wind pressed through cracks in the stone. Luke set the papers back into the satchel with careful hands, as though he were handling dynamite. He looked at Maria and gave a single nod. I swore once to protect this town. I failed them. I won't fail you. She almost smiled, but the sound that followed killed it before it could grow. Hoofbeats. Faint at first, then stronger, echoing across the hard ground outside, too many to mistake for a stray patrol. The sound circled, a slow tightening noose. Maria's eyes went wide. They found us, she whispered. Her hand reached for his sleeve, trembling. Luke stood, drawing his revolver, his body casting a long shadow against the altar. He listened as the hoofbeats stopped, replaced by boots crunching against the churchyard gravel. The lantern flickered, shadows stretching long across the ruined walls. Then the doors blew open with a crash of splintering wood. Briggs stepped through, torchlight burning behind him, and his men swarmed in like a tide of wolves. The truth is out, but can the sheriff carry it to dawn? Stay with the story, and if you're drawn to these Western reckonings of justice and betrayal, hit subscribe now to ride with us through every storm. Gunfire tore the silence apart, bullets splintering the pews and ripping through the rotted wood as Marston shoved Maria down behind the altar. The ruined church filled with smoke and firelight, Briggs's men spilling through the doorway like a flood. Luke fired into the blur, each shot booming, muzzle flash painting the walls. One rider dropped, another spun, screaming as he clutched his arm. The stench of gunpowder mixed with dust and sweat, choking every breath. Maria crawled low, clutching the satchel to her chest as Luke pressed his back against the altar. He glanced to the side door, the only chance of escape, but the riders pressed closer. Briggs laughed, his voice echoing under the crumbling rafters. Nowhere to run, Sheriff. Hand the girl over and maybe we'll let you breathe till sunrise. Before Luke could answer, a familiar voice rang above the chaos. A man in a gray coat, face half hidden under a wide-brimmed hat, fired at the altar. Luke recognized him with a shock. Jonas Weller, once a storekeeper in Red Mesa. The same man who had slipped Luke and Maria a canteen of water when they fled town. Now Jonas sneered through the gunsmoke. Vance pays more than your justice, Sheriff. His words were venom, a betrayal that cut deeper than any bullet. For a heartbeat, Luke faltered, rage boiling so hot it steadied his hands again. He grabbed Maria's arm. Move! They scrambled through the side door as bullets chewed up the stone arch above their heads. Outside, the night air felt like a furnace, the storm's breath carrying sand into their wounds. Luke stumbled, a searing pain tearing across his shoulder where a bullet had grazed him. Blood soaked through his coat, hot and slick. Maria pulled him into the shadows of the crumbling churchyard, propping him against the skeletal remains of a fence. She ripped fabric from her dress and pressed it against the wound, her hands trembling. Don't die on me, Sheriff, she whispered fiercely, eyes wet but unblinking. Luke clenched his teeth, breath ragged, tasting iron in his mouth. The night felt endless, the desert stretching out around them like an ocean of shadows. Every sound seemed amplified. The stamp of boots, the hiss of torches, the pounding in his chest. Then it came, a deep, mournful horn echoing through the desert night. Not Briggs's men this time, but something heavier, organized. Maria froze, looking toward the horizon. The sound rolled over the sand like the call of some ancient beast. Luke lifted his head, eyes narrowing through the haze of pain. He knew that horn. He'd heard it years ago during land disputes, when Elias Vance himself rode at the front of a column of hired guns. Maria's grip on his arm tightened. It's him. And out beyond the dunes, faint torchlight grew, fresh riders cutting through the night with Vance at their lead. The desert stretched wide and merciless under the paling sky. The storm had blown itself thin, leaving only streaks of dust and the hollow silence of dawn creeping at the edges of night. Luke Marston's horse stumbled over the dry wash, hooves slipping in loose stone, but he urged it forward, one hand pressed hard against his bleeding shoulder. Maria rode close behind, clutching the satchel tight against her ribs, her face drawn with exhaustion and fear. They had been riding for hours, the sound of pursuit never far, carried on the desert wind like a fever that would not break. Then at last the trail forked. To the east, the road dipped toward Red Mesa, where the courthouse and the judge waited, a chance at law, however slim. To the south, the trail bled toward Mexico, the border hidden behind low hills and dry gulches, a chance at escape, but nothing more. Luke pulled his horse to a stop, chest heaving, sweat streaking his dust-caked face. He stared down both paths as the horizon began to glow with the first thin strokes of sunrise. The light painted the land in red and gold as though the desert itself bled from every stone. His eyes narrowed. Maria reined in beside him, her breath ragged. "We'll never make Red Mesa," she said, her voice trembling. "Vance owns half the law there. Even if we did, what judge would take your word over his?" She looked south, desperation flaring. "If we cross into Mexico, we can disappear. Start again, live." Luke sat still, his revolver heavy at his side, his badge weighing on him like a ghost in his pocket. He had lived with running before, running from Dry Creek, from the graves of Henry Shaw and the others, running from his own failures. Every road he had taken since led him back to the same hollow cabin and the same silence. "If I run now," he whispered, his voice low, carried away on the faint breeze. "I'll never stop." Maria turned to him, eyes wide. "You'll die if you go east." Luke looked at her, saw the fire behind the fear. He saw Henry's eyes again, and the faces of the miners who had died beneath rock and dust. His jaw tightened. Better to die chasing justice than live hiding from it. The ground trembled faintly. Both of them heard it. The low rumble of hooves carried over the ridge, the sound of Vance's fresh riders drawing nearer, relentless as the tide. Maria's face shifted, her fear colliding with something deeper, acceptance. She nodded once, sharp, as though sealing her own fate. "Then we ride to Red Mesa," she said. Her voice steadied. "Even if it kills us." Luke gave a grim nod, spurred his horse, and the two of them broke east, the rising sun at their backs, painting their shadows long over the desert floor. The trail grew narrow, cutting between low rocks and scattered brush. The hooves of their pursuers beat louder behind, shouts rising with them. Maria's horse cried out suddenly, a high, strangled sound. The crack of a rifle followed a split second later. Her mount staggered, front legs folding, body crashing into the sand. Maria screamed as she was thrown hard against the earth, the satchel flying from her hands and skidding across the trail. Luke hauled his horse around, rage and panic tearing through him as he saw Maria struggling to rise, blood streaking her temple, her horse thrashing its last in the dirt. Another rifle cracked from the ridge. Dust spat at his feet. The riders were closer now, closing the noose with every heartbeat. Luke swung down from his saddle, boots hitting the dirt hard, and rushed to Maria. She was dazed, blood running from her temple, her breath shallow but steady. Without a word, he hauled her up, dragging her to his gelding. She groaned in pain, but he pushed her into the saddle, climbing up behind her, his good arm tight around her waist. He spurred the horse, and together they tore down the trail, leaving the dead animal behind in the dust. Maria clung weakly, her fingers barely grasping the satchel now slung across Luke's chest. Each breath rattled out of her, yet she kept her eyes open, staring at the horizon as though sheer will alone could carry them to safety. Luke's own wound burned, hot and wet under his shirt, but the fire in his veins kept him riding. The sun finally broke the horizon, casting the desert in a wash of red so deep it looked as though the earth itself bled. Shadows stretched long, carving the world into shapes of menace and light. Ahead, the trail ended abruptly in a dry riverbed, its cracked clay bottom catching the new light like broken glass. Luke pulled up, chest heaving, scanning for another way. But the pounding hooves behind him told him the truth. There was no way out. Briggs and his men fanned out across the ridge above the riverbed, rifles glinting in the rising sun. Briggs grinned down at them, scar twisting his face, rifle steady in his hands. "End of the trail, Sheriff. Hand her over and maybe I'll make it quick." Luke slid his revolver free, though his arm trembled from blood loss. He didn't answer. eyes locked on Briggs, weighing the shot he might never live to take. Maria stirred weakly in front of him, her hand fumbling at Luke's coat. She found the tarnished star, still pinned there though half hidden beneath dust and blood. With trembling fingers she pulled it free and lifted it high, the badge catching the sunlight. Her voice cracked but carried through the canyon. "This man is the law. You can't bury the law." The words rippled like a stone tossed in still water. From behind Briggs's men, figures began to appear. Townsfolk who had followed the chase, drawn by the sound of gunfire and the rising smoke of the sheriff's burning cabin. Farmers, miners, women clutching children's hands. They stood on the edges watching, fear in their eyes but something else beneath it. Recognition. Luke saw them. So did Briggs. The outlaw's grin faltered. The townsfolk's eyes weren't on Briggs now. They were on the badge gleaming against the sunrise. On the satchel strapped against Luke's chest. Maria clutched it, holding it out for all to see, and some of the papers slipped free, fluttering into the dry riverbed. Hands snatched them up, voices murmuring as the damning words were read aloud. "Murderer." One whispered, "Thief." Another spat. The ripple spread louder now, the crowd shifting uneasily. Briggs barked, "Shut your mouths!" But the fire had already caught. Then the riders parted, and another figure pushed through. Elias Vance himself, dressed in black, silver trim gleaming, rode forward with calm authority. He drew a pistol as though the scene bored him, his eyes cold as stone. He leveled the barrel at Maria, his voice a hiss meant for all to hear. Enough. Elias Vance sat tall in his saddle, the desert sun burning red behind him, pistol steady in his hand. His dark coat shimmered with silver trim, a man cloaked in wealth and power even here in the dust. He looked down on Luke Marston and Maria as though they were already dead, his lip curling in amusement. "What's this circus?" he drawled, his voice cutting across the crowd that had gathered along the ridge and in the dry riverbed. "A handful of dirty papers? Words on paper don't hang a man." He gave a short laugh, and some of his riders echoed it nervously, though their eyes darted to the townsfolk behind them. Maria, pale and bloodied, pushed herself upright in the saddle. Her voice shook, but the fury inside steadied it. "They're not just words. They're names. The dead you buried in Shaft 4. My brother's name is written in your blood, Elias Vance." She held up the affidavit, her hand trembling. "This was signed by the man you left to die. He named you. He named what you did." Vance's smile thinned. He lifted his pistol a fraction higher. "Miners die every day. Men take risks. It's the cost of fortune, the cost of progress." From the edge of the crowd, a miner stepped forward, dust still clinging to his boots. His voice cracked with rage. "You blew that shaft on purpose." "My cousin was in there." He clawed at rock until his fingernails split. "I buried what was left of him in a bucket." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, sharp and restless. Vance sneered, but the cracks in his armor began to show. He snapped his fingers, and Briggs edged his horse forward, rifle in hand. But the whispers grew louder. "Murderer. Thief. Liar." The word spread like wildfire, the townsfolk closing ranks. Luke Marston straightened in his saddle, revolver loose at his side, blood soaking his shirt, but his eyes steady as stone. He met Vance's gaze. "You think money makes you untouchable. You think these people will bow because you've got guns and silver, but the truth's out now. You can't shoot every tongue that speaks it." Vance laughed again, but it rang hollow. His eyes narrowed, hate burning deep. "I don't need to shoot every tongue, just yours." The crowd fell to silence, the desert holding its breath. The sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the cracked clay. Luke's chest rose and fell once, steady, his revolver poised. He heard Henry's voice again, that boyish oath. "Never run, Sheriff. Never let them take the town." Vance's sneer curled as he drew the pistol tight. "You'll be dead before the sun's full up." The two men stared across the gap of dust in silence. Luke fired first. The crack split the dawn. Vance's body jerked, eyes wide in disbelief, his pistol tumbling from his hand as he toppled sideways from the saddle. He hit the ground hard, dust rising around him. The silver trim of his coat dulled in dirt and blood. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the town gasped. Briggs' face twisted in horror, his rifle shaking in his grip. He glanced at the fallen body of his master, then at the crowd pressing closer, the hatred in their eyes now unchained. His nerve broke. He yanked his horse around, spurring it into the open desert. His men followed, scattering like crows startled from a carcass, leaving only hoofprints in the clay. The silence left behind was heavier than the storm had ever been. Maria clutched the satchel to her chest, eyes shining with tears and fire. Luke lowered his revolver slowly, smoke curling from the barrel, his arm trembling now that it was over. The townsfolk stared at him, their faces caught between awe and fear, between gratitude and doubt. The badge gleamed faintly in Maria's hand, the tarnished star that had once meant nothing now shining like a question. Luke met their eyes one after another, waiting, bleeding, wondering if they would stand with him or leave him to die alone in the dust. The sun has risen. The law still stands and justice has spoken. If you want more tales of the frontier where every choice carries a price, subscribe and saddle up for the next story waiting on the horizon. The desert finally stilled. The hoofbeats had faded into nothing, leaving only the creak of saddles and the low murmur of the waking earth as dawn stretched wide across the horizon. The red wash of sunrise burned over the cracked clay, turning every stone and shadow into fire. Luke Marston swayed in his saddle, his revolver slipping from his grip. Blood soaked the front of his shirt, warm against the morning chill. His breath rattled as he slid sideways, and Maria caught him with a cry, dragging him down into the dust. The townsfolk edged closer, no longer riders or farmers or widows, but witnesses. They gathered around the scattered papers, stooping to lift them from the ground. Hands smoothed the crumpled affidavit, fingers tracing the ink. Words were read aloud in trembling voices, and each name spoken carried like a prayer, like a reckoning. The whispers grew louder, passing through the crowd until the truth itself became undeniable. Maria knelt beside Luke, one arm steadying him as his weight bore down heavy. Her eyes brimmed, her face streaked with dirt and blood, yet her voice was gentle when she leaned close. You kept your promise. Luke's eyes fluttered open, gray as storm clouds, yet fixed on the light crawling over the horizon. His lips pulled into the faintest of smiles. Ride me through the night. I did. His head sagged back, his chest heaving slow, each breath a battle. The tarnished badge slipped from his coat, landing in the dust beside him. The sunlight caught it, turning the star bright, sharper than it had ever gleamed in the years it spent forgotten. For a long moment no one moved until Maria reached down and lifted it with steady fingers. She rose, standing tall though her body trembled, holding the badge high. The law still stands, she said. Her voice rang clear, stronger than the morning bell in the old church they had fled. The crowd straightened, their murmurs dying into silence as they looked at her, then at Marston, then at the badge glinting like fire in her hand. The sun climbed higher, washing the desert in gold and red. The long shadows stretched across the riverbed, reaching past the fallen body of Elias Vance, past the scattered rifles of his broken men, past the townsfolk who had once bowed their heads in silence. And as the day broke fully, Vance's empire began to crumble, not with fire or gunshot, but with the weight of truth carried on every tongue that had once been afraid to speak. The desert sky burned and the law endured,